Hello there. I just wanted to make this video, a short video, about the subject of culture war and culture wars in the political sense, because I think it's quite it's a funny and telling thing, and also it's quite irritating. But I've watched the development of this, if I think back on it, since the 1970s, really. The whole sense of culture war, as in a kind of self-conscious cultural projects and cultural interventions for political motivations. This is something which the left, or the people who consider themselves to be the left, have been using and developing and pushing since the 1970s, but that was never considered to be culture war at that point. The ones who were probably more honest and less ironic about what they were doing would have considered it to be agitation and propaganda, probably, or a form of that, with various kinds of plug-ins to popular culture and what have you. But this was very common amongst the so-called left. It's only when people started pushing back against it using the same techniques that suddenly it's a culture war, which is funny, because you see, when the left was doing it, it wasn't a culture war, it was progress, But when the people push back against it because they have different views, then suddenly it's meant to be something quite sinister and fractious and destructive. Well, if it was destructive, why were you doing it all along? That's certainly one thing that really strikes me about this whole sense of the culture war. It's worth remembering, though, that this is something which has been pioneered by those people that term themselves the left, for two reasons. One is to understand that when the left complain about it, they really have very little to complain about, But the other is that if you don't like the way these things are going, you should be aware that these techniques and these strategies are of the left, in a sense, And so the fractiousness, the destructiveness, all of these things are, for instance, they're not really characteristic of actual conservatism, for instance. They really aren't, and so that's also worth bearing in mind. We are in a very, very sad state of affairs where so much has been destroyed culturally, and where there has been so much intellectual and philosophical poison injected into the system and advanced through it. But I think it's worth asking yourself, do you really want to use the methods of the left to try and combat the left, if that's what you want to do? And I don't, as I've made clear before. I like this whole thing of left-right. I think it's actually it actually bolsters the sense of the validity of the so-called left, because it makes people imagine that there are just two options, two ways of thinking, and that they are somehow kind of balanced out, equal. Well, they're not. They really aren't. I actually think the majority of people are much nearer to conservatism than they are to the left. The left is based upon radical ideologies, largely. It just is, and most people are not there for most of their lives, It's, because the left has ideologies which are ideologies of the young, the inexperienced, and the desperate, And you can have, compassion and understanding for all of these groups, and we've all been there at one time or another, though some people have definitely been wiser than others. But those these you can have compassion for these groups, but are these really the guides for life and for society and what have you? Well, you have to make up your mind on that, don't you? But the idea that this kind of like this sense of the moral position of the left is, I think, quite fallacious. It really is, and it's led on from a materialism and the destruction of spirituality. I think to put it in a nutshell, that will be the subject of another video. But in terms of the culture war, I just wanted to point out that the culture war is something which is actually very old. It's something which has generally been waged in the way that we understand it by people who consider themselves to be the left, but it simply wasn't pushed back on, and so it wasn't called a culture war at that point. I guess it's only a culture war when the left feels threatened, basically. Anyway, that's my video for today.